What we're going to look at today is the aggregate supply curve, or the concept of aggregate supply. So aggregate supply is different from microeconomic supply in the sense that it does not talk about, or it does not pertain to the microeconomy. It actually refers to the macroeconomy and the supply, or the total supply, of final goods and services in an economy. So what the aggregate supply definition is the total quantity of all goods and services produced. That's meant to be produced by every Australian firm. So it is basically the total production in an economy, and this is generally measured by the concept of GDP, so gross domestic product. So this is aggregate supply. It consists of all the economic activity being produced by every Australian firm over the year. So we can separate aggregate supply into two components. We can talk about the short run aggregate supply, or we can talk about the long run aggregate supply. So in the short term, or the short run, aggregate demand is usually the critical determinant of how much firms produce. So short run aggregate supply is determined by aggregate demand, whereas the long run aggregate supply is in fact determined by the nation's productive capacity. So let's look at what the graph of an aggregate supply curve looks like. So like aggregate demand, we're going to map GDP, or real GDP, or income, Y, to inflation, denoted by pi. So what we can see here is that we have two separate aggregate supply graphs, which sort of looks a bit like this. And if we want to break it down into more simplistic form, we can just talk about aggregate supply as being separated into the long run and the short run aggregate supply curves. So we have the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. So as we can see, in the short run aggregate supply curve, inflation stays constant at pi 0, and the long run aggregate supply curve, the potential GDP at Y star is unchanged if the productive capacity of a nation does not change. So why does it mean, why is this inflation rate unchanged in the short run aggregate supply curve? It's because a short run aggregate supply curve is solely determined by aggregate demand. So if you have aggregate demand here, and if this is shifting to the left or shifting to the right, we're seeing that the aggregate supply is determined by how much is demanded by consumers. So what this means is that inflation stays constant in the short run. So this is less than a year, or in the very short run. And what this means is that inflation is inert. And there are two main factors contributing to the inertial rate of inflation. And first of all, we're going to talk about why inflation is inert. So the first concept of why inflation is inert is due to menu costs. So if we were to walk into a pizza shop and the pizzas cost $17 for a large pizza, we're obviously going to demand this the pizza at $17 because we see that the marginal benefit of consuming this pizza is greater than $17. So we're going to demand this. So let's say, what if 100 people decide to walk into that pizza shop, and the pizza owner decides, okay, now that demand has increased, I have the scope to change this pizza price to $17, to excess of $17. So let's say $20 now. So I have the scope to increase it to $20 because I want to maximize my profits, and because the demand for pizza is so great now. However, what if the next day we only have, say, so initially we have 100 people wanting to buy it at $20. What if the next day only 10 people come into the pizza shop because the weather is so cold and people decide they're sick of pizzas now? So wouldn't the producer or the business have to decrease their price to $15 to change the price of pizza and to encourage more purchases of pizza? So in theory, this should work. That price signals or relative prices send price signals to businesses so that they change their price in order to meet prevailing economic or market conditions. However, in practice, this is rarely done because of the concept of menu costs. It becomes impractical for this pizza owner and for the general overall economy or producers to change their costs every so often to meet the prevailing economic conditions. So if the pizza initially cost $17, they're going to change that to $20 and then back to $15, and maybe the next day it becomes $16. To do this, they have to change or to make new menus, because it becomes legally binding that they should advertise their costs of their pizzas as on their menus. So it becomes a legal constraint that they do advertise the correct price of their pizzas. So this, in fact, causes businesses to actually print out new paper, print out new menus, change the prices every day to meet prevailing economic conditions. And so this becomes impractical and becomes another cost to businesses, so that they don't change their prices in the short run. And only in the long run, when they know for certain that the demand for pizza has increased on average to, say, from 50 people or 50 buyers a day to 100, should they actually increase their menu prices. But in the short run, they're not going to change their menu prices because of the menu costs involved in actually changing it every day. So printing out new paper, changing the menus, getting market research done, and all those costs involved in changing menu prices. So in the short run, we're going to say that the suppliers are just going to supply as much as it is demanded by the entire economy. And the second concept is the concept of contracts. Contracts constrict or constrain the inflation rate in the short term, because let's look at the concept of labor resources. If we know that prevailing economic conditions have caused consumer confidence to decrease and therefore jobs to be lost, businesses can't just decrease their labor costs. They can't just decrease the minimum wage or the wages they've paid to their employees, because they have signed contracts. They've signed a contract to say, okay, I'm going to work for you at $50,000 a year for 5 years. So assuming the second year consumer confidence has gone down and that the businesses no longer need this labor cost. So they can't just decrease the inflation rate in the short run, because they have to pay out the labor, and therefore that incurs another cost to businesses. And similarly, they can't just increase the inflation rate or decrease or increase the contracts of labor or the wages if there is high demand for labor in the short run, because of this idea of that their labor is contracted for a number of years. So that means they can't really increase or decrease the short run aggregate supply curve in the very, very short run. And this means inflation stays constant due to two factors: due to the inertia rate of inflation and also due to menu costs, which is due to menu costs, and also the idea of contracts. So now we can see that aggregate supply in the short run is determined by aggregate demand. So the suppliers will produce at whatever is demanded by the consumers of the economy. Okay, let's work this all out. So let's look at the determinants of long run aggregate supply, which is determined by a nation's productive capacity. And we talked about the production possibility frontier, which is how much the nation can produce with the available resources, technology, and capital that they have. So the long run aggregate supply curve is determined by different supply side conditions, and this includes labor, capital, which is also determined by investment spending, and also efficiency. So we're going to look at how much labor and capital and efficiency there are in the economy. And so the long run aggregate supply curve can only shift to the left or shift to the right if there are changes in this curve. So you have the long run aggregate supply, you have Y, and you have the price. So this can only shift to the right if labor increases, if capital increases, or efficiency increases. In the long run, we're going to see a stable or a potential rate of output exhibited by this economy due to the labor constraints, the capital constraints, and the efficiency constraints exhibited. And so in the long run, even if aggregate demand should increase, they're only going to be able to produce at this long run aggregate supply level of production. So the total quantity of all goods and services produced has an upwards limit of production. And once the economy reaches this upward limit, in the long run, they will just start increasing prices to discourage demand and therefore return to this initial potential output. And we're going to talk about a lot of this aggregate supply and aggregate demand analysis in further lectures. But now we know what the concept of aggregate supply is that you can split it up into two. You have the short run aggregate supply, which has an inertial rate of inflation. So inflation stays constant in the short run, and aggregate supply is determined by aggregate demand. And you also have the long run aggregate supply, where aggregate supply in the long run is determined by the nation's productive capacity in the form of labor, capital, and the efficiency at which people or employees or businesses utilize the labor and capital resources.